major points from our chapter that illustrate this particular point.
It's Felix Guattari who tells us that we get the unconscious we deserve, and suggests that contrary to Freud, our unconscious desires are not forged in the sexual perversities of the nuclear family, but in the realm of what he terms preconscious social investment. He argues that it's the social field that gives rise to preconscious social investments, such as class, that shape those social formations, such as individuals and families. Deleuze and Guattari propose the production of social libidinal investments as being composed out of a relation between two poles, the paranoiac reactionary and the fascizing pole, and the schizoid revolutionary pole. These poles, while binary, should not be seen as mutually exclusive. In fact, they operate as a continuum of becoming. However, this continuum is not linear, as in degrees of difference laid out on a line from one point to another. Rather, each pole functions through degrees of intensity, continually pushing towards threshold conditions of transformation. In this sense, all libidinal investment oscillates between poles of structure and flow. That is to say, between what Gregory Bateson termed homeostasis and what Moira Gattens refers to as morphogenesis. Homeostasis being the drive towards stabilized equilibrium, and morphogenesis being the drive towards the continual and infinite unfolding of form and structure. This is the compositional field through which the elements of production in any given historical period are composed and decomposed. As structure and flow reach varying degrees of intensity, the structures social, biological, organic, and inorganic array themselves in varying degrees of compositions of affiliation, premised in the ability of an ecological system to sustain their survival over time.
According to Deleuze, our current historical period is premised in open systems of constant modulation. We are no longer fitted to conforming molds of identification and habit, but instead subjected to an ever-shifting array of social structures, political affiliations, training regimes, and identities. All of this variation and difference evokes profound anxiety and what Deleuze calls a life of infinite deferral where no one ever arrives. Nothing stabilizes. On the one hand, this sounds a great deal like the infinite oscillations of living systems. However, our contemporary virtual society, rather specifically, is not a living system. It mimics the processes of life, but it is, as Baudrillard would suggest, a copy of a copy of a copy. The rapid shifts and modulations of our contemporary society are geared towards covering a system of absolute abstraction premised on a radically entropic center of value. That center is capital, and the system is designed to do one thing and one thing only. All of the variations and modulations are really just side effects, and that is to do what Marx predicted long ago, to have money make money, to translate all living creative force into abstract calculations of monetary equivalence. This emerging system of capitalist control and apparatus of capture strives to be all-encompassing. In abstracting creative capacity for thought and affiliation, it opens avenues into all aspects of living form. Perhaps most importantly, it opens onto the virtual field of unconscious desire and production. In other words, capitalism no longer cares how we manage ourselves physically or even consciously. Of greater interest is a direct line into our unconscious field of desire. However, not desire as lack. Capitalism has already largely exhausted that vehicle through extensive interventions that promise to deliver all we yearn for but can't reach. To a large degree, we have become cynically inured to those promises. Instead, capital is now interested in unconscious desire as virtual creative capacity, be all you can be, and more.
The question for us becomes, what kind of politics stands any possibility of proposing a viable difference to such a system? It is here that we might arrive at the question of subversion. We would propose that it is a politics of subversion that could not foundations of virtual global capital and simultaneously undermine it while turning it into compost for new worlds and new peoples. We are attracted to the concept of subversion as a process of turning from beneath. If capitalism is producing modes of subjectification premised in the capacity to transform our subjectivity into sheer abstractions as simulacra of living form, then the field on which subversive politics must be played is the arena of subjectification or the production of subjectivity. We have suggested that this is a plane of immanent unconscious desiring production that has as its primary mechanism the shift from the virtual to the actual. The question then is, who are we to become if we are not this? Perhaps rather than becoming all we can be, we might entertain becoming useless. While capitalism is a monolithic system of absolute abstraction, living systems are more complex. Living systems incorporate both material and abstract systems of organization in complex ecologies of desiring production. In order to exist and persist, capitalism requires the production of profit, and profit requires an infinite expansion of abstract surplus. That is to say, capitalism must produce ever-proliferating systems of abstract code. The code itself is autopoietic and reproduces itself out of itself, but it is reliant on disturbances of its environment by living systems that can be encoded. While capitalism as an immanent system is all-pervasive at the level of abstract codification, it has little or no direct relation to the mechanisms of immanent materiality.
Deleuze points to creativity as a vehicle for breaking the circuit of self-referential communication that is the bread and butter of capitalist accumulation in the early part of the 21st century. He tells us that we need to refuse the commands to communicate via the linguistic codes of virtual capital by creating vacuoles of non-communication. He proposes that we hijack speech and turn the creative capacities to other living things. Turn the creative capacities of living things. The question then is, how are we to become useless through creating such spaces?
By vacuole, Deleuze is referring to a small cavity or space in the tissue of an organism. It is often found in the tissues of the nervous system as the result of disease. The key to politics in this sense is to produce diseases in the communication system of the body politic capitalism. We can only imagine that Deleuze is thinking that to create spaces of non-communication in a system, premised as Luhmann would have it, as a series of communication systems, would trigger what he calls circuit breakers. Circuit breakers in this sense would be Batesonian-type mechanisms that would disrupt the runaway escalation of binary overcoding that drives capitalism to encase itself deeper and deeper into systems of abstract signification, radically scissioned from the checks and balances of phenomenological experience. To become useless in this way is to become a disease within the body of capitalist relations. Such a disease is premised in ecological and relational creativity, that is, doing rather than speaking, creating rather than communicating. It is to be found in a politics premised in the radical relations of multiple alterities. Such assemblages of radical difference are composed out of the generative responses of bodies in collision.
To become useless to capital is to some degree to engage in what Brododi refers to as disidentifying oneself. To become a nomadic subject is to embrace what she defines as, quote, the cruel, messy outsideness of life itself, end quote. It is to open oneself beyond the formations of historical binary taxonomies and hierarchies of the self to engage in the flow of virtuality that is all that moves through us. Revolutions are messy business with little or no purity to be found. They inevitably fail if the goal is merely a transformation of rule. For us, it is the question of sustaining the creative virtual force of life. During periods of great transition, chaos, and upheaval, where empires desperately engage in runaway escalations of force, it is the useless that represents the world to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. All right, so we're live, and a lot of people are engaging in the chat, and many are excited. So everything is going well right now. So Lois, you are up next. The floor is yours. I don't hear you though, so let's make sure that the mic is working. I can't hear you. So there's a microphone symbol in the center, and there's an arrow. If you click on that, you can select your input.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you, Robert. And it's nice to follow both you and Hans and Kathy. For me, critical psychology is a necessary starting point that should take us in many directions, hopefully some of them entirely unexpected. And this book's chapters show some of those unexpected directions, which I'm very happy about. Mine shows another. The end of knowing as critical praxis, practical critical activity, is outlined in my chapter. And that refers to social therapeutics, the practice of method originally developed 40 years ago by Fred Newman and myself, and now carried on by hundreds of psychologists, activists, educators in communities, NGOs, and universities throughout the world. Like so many, we strive for a more equitable, just, and peaceful world. Like other critical psychologists, we believe that the dominant non-critical psychology stands in the way of realizing such a world. The critical psychologists I'm most familiar with are those that are from the US and the UK, and I thank Robert for the website that you gave us in your opening remarks, which I will definitely become much more familiar with. From the US and the UK, I find it useful to characterize the various approaches in the following types that are put there according to the source or the basis of the critique. They are identity-based, ideology-based, epistemology-based, and ontology-based. This last one refers to social therapeutics, the work that I've been involved in developing. For us and the global practitioners of social therapeutics, identity-based, ideology-based, and epistemologically based critical psychologists don't go nearly far enough, for it is identity, ideology, and epistemology themselves that stand in the way of people creating an equitable, fair, and just world. For they are what human beings are socialized to believe in and to rely on as to what makes us human. They are both the glasses and the mirrors through which we have learned to perceive. This overly cognitive perceptual orientation impacts how we feel, how we think, what we believe exists, and what we believe possible. Who am I without an identity? How would I know what is right without an ideology? How can I act without knowing what to do? People don't, as a rule, spend time pondering these issues in the abstract, but we do live our lives as if we are or should be guided by those kinds of questions. Indeed, our very wants and needs are shaped by assumptions about identity, ideology, and epistemology, regardless of how firm or shaky a particular individuals might be. And this is in accord with mainstream psychology's authoritarian insistence that it knows what people are, what makes us sick, what makes us tick, what we want, and how we come to know what we want. Psychology not only dictates to us, it shapes us as dictators to ourselves. Question: how can we escape this fly bottle? I suggest we have a shot at it if we go beyond the critical to the practical critical. I take that term from Marx, for whom it meant revolutionary activity, the changing of ourselves that is dialectically united with world changing. As an ontological critique of mainstream psychology and psychotherapy, it and social therapeutics represents a move from the critical, opposition, resistance, destruction, or deconstruction, to the practical critical, creating something new out of what exists, or deconstruction in reconstruction. It represents a move from applying method to practicing method, from using method as an instrumental tool meant to yield results, to method as dialectically united with results. In my chapter, I discuss 4 features of this practical critical methodology to highlight as especially relevant to the future of critical psychology. I cannot share all 4 of them with you, but I will probably get through 2 of them. 1, engage the epistemological bias. The authoritarianism of Western ways of knowing is often and very well critiqued, including by critical psychologists, and that includes myself. And while non-Western epistemology should be honored and respected along with all the other features of a given culture, I think that all epistemologies are authoritarian. It is that posture itself, the epistemic posture, that's a fetter to revolutionary activity. All people are, to a greater or less extent, guided unconsciously or consciously by a knowing paradigm, that we can and must know what is, what to do, who we are, how we feel, what is real and what is right and what is true. Institutions, the education, the law, economics, psychology, science, religion, derive their authority from that. They socialize us to ways of understanding and feeling and relating that are in the current times conservative and destructive. Living by the knowing paradigm stifles creativity and discovery, closes off other ways of understanding, and constrains our ability to imagine and create a new world. The second feature, don't confuse power with authority. As a child of the 60s, I still bristle when I hear the word power used negatively by progressives as a pejorative, as something bad or even evil, and a property of those who rule. I'm still a believer in power to the people. I don't know exactly when power lost its revolutionary meaning, but the talk today is most often about the exercise and abuse of power by those in power. What then could it mean to empower people? These are different uses of the word power in different contexts, but they're not just merely that. Leaving it as, well, they're just different uses, different contexts, masks an important distinction that I have found invaluable in my political understanding and work. That distinction is between power and authority. Power being created from the bottom, and authority being imposed from the top. From this vantage point, being in power and exercising power are as different as can be. Being in power is the commodification of power into authority. Exercising power is engaging collectively, democratically, and creatively in practical, critical, revolutionary activity without commodification. We all know about how professionalized and institutional psychology and its various offshoots practice and promote all manner of dehumanizing authoritarian commodification. The DSM, the ICD, diagnoses, identity, psychology, identity politics, testing, evaluation, the most obvious ones. But the authority of these institutions is so thorough that people not only commodify themselves and others in these ways, we feel we need to. At the same time, I think that people really not only need but want to exercise power without commodification. And psychologically, those two are in constant struggle. The need to authoritarianly commodify oneself and the need to exercise power without commodification. How do we do that? How do we exercise power free of authority? Well, the other two that I speak about are to reinitiate the development of persons and communities. Unlike mainstream psychology that is interested in who we are and in predicting who we will become because of its epistemological basis and its authoritarianism, I think a practical, critical approach recognizes that we are at the same time who we are becoming. We are always who we are and not who we are. We live in history as well as in a particular society, culture, space, and time. However, we experience ourselves, most of us, most of the time, only societally, rather than dialectically living in society and history. People don't feel themselves as self and world changers, as creators of qualitative transformation, as active bringers into being new ways of feeling and relating to themselves and others. So that my belief and my experience from 40 years plus is that reinitiating the development of persons and communities involves building environments in which people can stop being only who they are, only societal, and simultaneously become who they are not, become who they're becoming, historical, in which they can engage in the revolutionary activity of creating new wants and new needs and new emotions and new relationships. And the fourth feature is how I think that can be accomplished. And I don't think I have time to talk about that right now. And that is what two things that people in every culture, as far as we know, do, which is they play and they perform. Both depend on being who we are and simultaneously not who we are at the very, very same time. That pretty much is the process and ontology of practicing method, that human beings are both who we are and who we're becoming, and who we are becoming as creators of tools that can abolish the present state of things by the continuous transformation of mundane, specific life practices into new forms of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since the first part of my speech was not live stream, I might go at the very end after the Q&A, and you don't have to wait for that if you don't want to, but just so that it's in the video for posterity. All right, so up next is Michael. And by the way, people are writing a lot of comments about how much they're enjoying all the speakers so far. So.
Okay, so am I here?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So thank you, Robert, for putting all of this together and having me be a part of it. I should also thank Derek Hook, who was my co-presenter at the conference, who asked me to have a debate about the role of Lacan for critical psychology, which created a nice opportunity for me to do some work I've been wanting to do for about 20 years, which was some thinking that hovers between psychoanalysis, psychology, philosophy, and a very amateurish ethnography. But the ethnographic part, the need to discuss or disclose some of what gets said aloud by Lacanians rather than in print, seems indispensable to me in looking to understand how a Lacanianism, which would be held apart from Lacan's work, works in vivo, which is in turn indispensable for thinking about how it would intersect with a critical praxis. And how can one resist a desire to do some anthropology of Lacanianism, having seen some of the stories that I've been witness to and that show up in this chapter. The chapter examines the way in which Lacan positions himself as a critic of psychology and of the uncritical imprinting upon Freud that the analysts of his day had done, taking them to task for becoming more of a police force that enforced both an imaginary fealty to Freud through a sort of mimesis and a code of normative behavior. But the difficulty, of course, is that by Lacan's insistence on purity in one's interpretation of Freud, he effectively conscripted a police force of his own followers who will judge not only whether other analysts, clinicians, or thinkers are respecting what they call the truth of the Freudian discovery, but inevitably whether their understandings of Lacan are worthy. I trace some of the roots of this police work beginning during Lacan's life and stretching far beyond his death, which involves a frequent return to dismissals of heretical readings of Lacan as illegitimate or as quite frequently confused, as Jane Gallup was accused of being. Venturing beyond the field of Lacanianism itself, attacks from Lacanians upon non-Lacanian thinking are, of course, foundational. And perhaps most foundational to my discussion is the attack on psychology that Lacan himself began. In that critique, we might see a major form of hope for a Lacanian critical psychology. Lacan strikes us, for example, as surprisingly progressive at times, given his patrician reputation and his awareness of people like Gardner's colonialism and racism. He referred to Gardner and Dubois as American Procrusteans who torment with their yardstick the mystery of supposedly primitive souls. But a perennial difficulty with Lacan's treatment of psychology, as of other fields, is that despite the overwhelming sense of expertise that seems to flow through his prose, he's seldom a faithful, careful, or respectful reader of the texts he critiques. Perhaps the most famous example of this is his cavalier treatment of Saussurean linguistics and the notion of the sign, but another noteworthy one is what Begay called his misuse of the psychology that furnished the facts at the basis of his Mirror Stage article. Well, talking about misuse of psychology is obviously open to critique itself. I think that Begay is right on the substance there. Lacan commits, at the very least, an abuse of psychological scholarship, which includes a frank reversal of Kohler's statement that chimpanzees do not lose interest in their mirror images. But we must concede that no matter how dilettante Lacan's engagement may be, it's nonetheless some kind of engagement. And it's not often the case that, however, that the Lacanian secondary literature, no matter its level of rigor within the Lacanian field, continues that tradition. That literature frequently echoes Lacan on the disqualifying flaws of psychology, revisiting its confusion of the ego with the subject, its naive Cartesianism, its unapologetic lack of theoretical rigor, and its pride of position as an agency of social control. While those criticisms are important, their reproductions almost never cite the psychology they purport to criticize. And when they do, they cite generally only those psychologists that Lacan himself addressed, directly or indirectly. Figures like Baldwin, Wallon, Skinner, for example. This is to some degree borne out in Parker, who Robert referred to earlier, and his stance of utter rejectionism in Lacanianism as a barred psychology. Because Lacan's work is taken up as wholly transcending or rejecting the ontological and epistemological bases of psychology, it is not to be, quote, confused with or made to mix with psychology. Lacanians then tend to keep their attention only on the work of Lacan and his fellow travelers within the continental philosophical tradition or literature and film studies. And that rejectionist Lacanian insistence that Lacan's work was antithetical psychology comes hand in hand with license not only to ignore his engagement with psychology, nor only to direct contempt in psychology's general direction, but it seems to allow the Lacanian to be utterly unconcerned with what the discipline of psychology is, even at the most basic level. One routinely hears in conversation, for example, a gross conflation of American ego psychology, which was a form of psychoanalysis, with psychology. Nor, with some few exceptions, does the Lacanian literature make much room for a conception of psychology as anything beyond the highly positivistic, quantitative natural science psychology, neglecting to even recognize the formidable voice of, say, human science psychology, which has actively challenged the structural bases of positivist psychology with which Lacan took issue, building on the same philosophical literature so well known to Lacanians. And that lack of engagement, if not the sole property of Lacanianism, is also not necessarily typical of a critical approach to psychology. Non-Lacanian critics of psychology, no strangers themselves to the literature of rigorous philosophical examination, are clearly willing, and some might say intellectually obligated, to engage. It would seem that such a willingness to engage with the current state of affairs in psychology in an academically rigorous manner might allow the followers of Lacan to have their voices heard and effect meaningful change outside the increasingly cryptic walls of their pantheon. But that doesn't seem to happen, and I think a key to the reason why is in the extraordinarily ironic pride of place in Lacanianism for identification. And that's what's central to my concern here. Lacan made a scathing critique of his contemporaries, of psychoanalysts, for having merely identified with an image of Freud, as well as overvaluing the imaginary in other ways. But contemporary Lacanianism revisits this mode of criticism on psychology, but also on other would-be Lacanians, other forms of psychoanalysis and popular culture. But on examination, it does so, it seems, out of identification with Lacan. and thus reenacts the original Lacanian problem, identification with the master. And that identification with the master leads us to what a Lacanian might call the non-rapport of mastery and critique. Lacan's notion of the master's discourse, based on Hegel's lordship and bondage dialectic, posits that the master, in order to maintain his existence, must constantly cover up his own lack, his own unjustifiability, his own contingency and vulnerability. Instead, the master is always directing his demand to the other's labor. To visit Hegel's view of this relationship, the struggle for the absolute power of one consciousness over the other results in the fact that the subjugated consciousness, slave or bondsman, cannot freely offer recognition of the master without thereby undoing his mastery. Therefore, the demand for recognition must be a demand for misrecognition as a complete, justified master, and can only continue as the result of a threatening dominance. According to Hegel, just where the master has effectively achieved lordship, he really finds that something has come about quite different from an independent consciousness. It is not an independent, but rather a dependent consciousness that he has achieved. That is, the master is not only dependent, but is dependent upon a misrecognition of his own being. Mastery, then, it would seem, in foreclosing free recognition, stands an absolute refusal of reflexivity. The position of mastery is therefore structurally incapable of becoming either the object of critique or the locus of critical consciousness. As Fink says, the master is unconcerned with knowledge as long as everything works, as long as his power is maintained, all is well. But that tone is misleading because it's not a matter of indifference. It is, as Hegel reminds us, a struggle to the death. The master must constantly demand, attack, and exploit in order to maintain his position. And this is the essence of the impediment between Lacanianism and criticality. A good Lacanian who identifies with the master, and therefore does the work of the bondsman, must refuse critique. She must seek to subject the other and never be the subject of critique, of recognition, of vulnerability. The maintenance of this position may be an unspoken benefit of the well-worn Lacanian dismissal of the analyst's ego, the exploration of countertransference, or the encounter between balanced two persons. To be a good Lacanian, in quotes, is to remind the other, to remind others that they, now in the position of bondsmen themselves, have failed conformation to a Lacanian image, while shrouding oneself in jargon that sounds like the master's master. It is, above all, to cover one's own lack. The compulsion to cover one's lack, I believe, leads to violence in service of the identification with mastery, a violence directed, as we've come to see, toward a variety of others, going beyond academic enemies. So my chapter begins to explore ways in which the Lacanian movement perpetrates this violence toward people, including women, the trans community, and people with autism. I'm also interested there in the colonial dimension of Lacanianism, which finds itself represented in my paper by my encounter with a Venezuelan analyst who was present at Lacan's visit to Caracas from France at the end of his life and bore witness to the energy that transferred into her body when she touched his garment. She also provided an answer to the question of the ever-elusive outcome of a Lacanian psychoanalysis, which she informed me was a lifelong, full-bodied orgasm. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Up next is Serdar.
Hello, am I coming through?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, what I would like to do is to share my screen, and I haven't used Jitsi before. So let me do this, which I think is done this way. Can you see it? Does it work?
Yes, we can see the text.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to start out with this biographical note from the book. This is useful for those of us who are not from the US and from other places, which are generally treated as marginal. So I'm from Turkey, and I used to be a professor of developmental and community psychology until I was fired for having signed a peace manifesto. As if that was not enough, in 2017, I was banned from public service for life, which means I was turned into living dead, as they call it, no chances of employment. So I was forced to go in exile, and I have held visiting positions in several places, including Cairo, Macerata in Italy, Brussels, and more recently in Frankfurt. Most of my work is groundbreaking because I tend to focus on neglected or completely avoided topics, sometimes taboo topics, such as martyrdom in Turkey, for instance, militarism, psychosocial consequences of personal debt, corruptive influences of private universities. And I'm also very open to working with multiple methods. This includes producing documentaries. I have produced an award-winning documentary with a very good friend of mine on the university entrance exam in Turkey. I write for a Sunday paper, or rather a paper every Sunday. It's a socialist paper published in Turkey, and I focus on children's rights and children's well-being. This has been going on since 2008. Recently, I served as the president of the Society for Peace Psychology, and in the past, I have served as president of European Community Psychology Association. Perhaps of more interest is when I was the only psychologist from Turkey among those opposing APA's collusion, the American Psychological Association's collusion with the Bush administration. This collusion was often described as the single greatest health professional ethics scandal of the 21st century. Psychology is not, in any way short of ethics scandals, but this was probably the biggest. In 2008, I led a protest against the visit by the head of APA's ethics office to Istanbul. This person orchestrated basically the collusion with the Bush administration. When the protest, exposed an ethical scandal in the Turkish Psychological Association and attracted considerable media attention, I was ostracized by mainstream psychologists in Turkey. This continues to date. Now, this chapter does a number of things, which I will go into, but I should say that this is my very first work that appears in a volume titled Critical Psychology. I tend to think of critical psychology as too much focused on theory and criticizing. I'm generally more interested in action, focused on ending suffering, exploitation, and so on. But I'm very glad that this piece has appeared in this volume, and I would like to publicly thank Robert for waiting for me. As usual, I was behind. I was perhaps the last person to submit a manuscript, I don't know, but he was willing to wait for me, and I appreciate that. And I should perhaps add that most of my work I write in Turkish, and that those pieces of work that were published in Turkish are considered, as you might expect, trivial in mainstream psychology because they were not published in English. Anyway, so this chapter invites the reader to do the following. Know your history, which is the history of psychology. Expose the import-export business. Expose the neoliberal setup. Expect and expose taming efforts directed at critical voices. Criticize instructional materials, particularly marketed by publishers located in the global north. Challenge the dominance of colonial languages. And finally, anticipate local resistance, local being particularly in the global south, wherever the reader is located. So what I wanted to say with these 7 actions are as follows. Decolonizing psychology requires questioning the history of mainstream psychology, along with its curricula, teaching, and reproduction. This interrogation has to focus on enabling scholars and students to acquire filters, in other words, critical filters, to reject or keep practices based on context-bound epistemologies. In other words, we should reject epistemologies that are proposed as universal epistemologies that might apply everywhere, every time. Secondly, expose the import-export business. Mainstream psychology is produced in the global north, and I don't need to name the locations. Some of you are based in these locations. And mainstream psychology is marketed globally as knowledge, practice, model, and so on, under different names. Then what's needed is importers. You know, there's importers, scholars bring the product in, for instance, into Indonesia, and then there are always willing dealers who generally are practitioners who are interested in marketing it locally. So the product is produced in the global north, exported, then imported by particularly academics, and then there are always large numbers of practitioners who are interested in distributing it. So it's a capitalistic chain reaction. Thirdly, there's a need to raise awareness as to why and how universities act as agents of capitalism, how and why authoritarian regimes often prefer psychology as business, and how psychology as business turns researchers into entrepreneurs and reproduces capitalism at all levels. Some of you might be familiar with what's happening in Turkey. For instance, at this point, there's a dictatorship, and the dictatorship is very, very fond of mainstream psychology that operates as psychology as business. The regime controls the business, and the researchers are promoted as entrepreneurs, and they all agree on reproducing conservative order serving the neoliberal capitalism. Fourthly, critical psychologies in the global south often struggle with their direction. They keep reading, or many scholars keep reading, materials produced in the global north, and they try to keep up with the publications that often come from the global north. However, the serious challenges are corrupted and tamed, and colonial critical psychologies are produced by institutional forces. Most of these institutional forces are conservative, and they often are modeled after their counterparts in the global north. These two turn a blind eye to chronic gaps, injustices, and mass suffering. Fifth, focused criticism of instructional materials is needed. Such criticism provides ample material for exposing the colonial, particularly in textbooks. If you ever look at psychology textbooks, mainstream psychology textbooks produced in the global north, they provide extremely striking material useful for exposing mainstream psychology and how colonial it is. This raises students' awareness, and at the same time, it raises students' power, and then knowledge and justice demands. Sixth, challenging the dominance of colonial languages is needed. If this dominance is not challenged, the challenging coloniality would not be complete. Students, as you all well know, often learn psychology through colonial languages. This includes English, French, and a few other dominant colonial languages, including Spanish. Finally, decolonizing psychology and a reconstruction of the curriculum will never be easy. It will never be endorsed by all. To give an example from Turkey, for instance, if you were to try to reconstruct the curriculum and decolonize psychology, you would be met with a very stiff resistance by a large number of people, because many of the scholars who are considered prominent scholars have been trained in the global north, and they are very used to mainstream ways, including bean counting, including citations, the politics of citations, and so on. Decolonizing curricula will necessarily involve organizing and finding ways to overcome the resistance. I finish my chapter with the following paragraph. I say, 30 years ago, Todd Sloan noted that psychologists in the West ignored the societies of the Third World, viewing them as the proper subject matter for other disciplines. About 3 decades later, Santosh Pillai from South Africa wondered why psychology, whose primary purposes are to understand and benefit people, fails so miserably at both. Today, the answer and a way out are now clearer. As several scholars have suggested, mainstream psychology has helped the rise of the neoliberal order in the late 20th century. So mainstream psychology at this point is clearly complicit. Genuine efforts towards psychologies of liberation have come primarily from the global south. Psychologists, therefore, need to break with the legacy of coloniality and seek more liberatory stances. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serdar. Up next is Rachel, my colleague from Northern New Mexico College.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Good morning. And thank you so much, Robert, for having me here. I'm really honored to be here this morning. So, my name is Rachel Begay, and I'm Native American. I'm from the Pueblo of Santa Clara, and that's located about 1.5 miles south of Espanola, south of our college, Northern New Mexico College. And let's see here. Okay. So that evening we shared a dance, Native American Pueblo dance with the group, and it was called the Buffalo Dance. And the Pueblo that I come from is Santa Clara, and it's the name is given after our patron saint, Saint Clare. When the Spaniards first tried to rule over the Pueblos, they built churches giving each Pueblo a patron saint name. The traditional name for Santa Clara is Kap or Owinge, which means singing water, because at one time there were many natural springs within and around the Pueblo. The creek that we have that comes from our canyon still flows and is always, in a sense, singing. So hence the name Singing Water. There are 19 Pueblo tribes in New Mexico, and each Pueblo is a sovereign nation, meaning each body of land or reservation is under its own tribal governmental structure. However, all 19 Pueblos share similar belief systems, spiritually and lifestyle. Santa Clara is a Tewa-speaking Pueblo, which is located along the Rio Grande River, 1.5 miles south of Espanola. The Puye Cliff Dwellings are the ancestral home of the Santa Clara people. Puye Cliffs are a historical and archaeological landmark located in the mountains above the modern-day Pueblo. For more than 3 centuries, this locale was home to over 1,500 people who built villages, farmed, hunted game, and inhabited the cliff dwellings. Eventually, drought caused the springs to dry up and crops to fail, forcing the people to move their homes along the river. The translation for Puye Owinge is Buckskin Village, named for its abundance of elk and deer that were and still are hunted in the nearby canyon. Our ancestors used every bit of the animal hides to clothe themselves and for our native ceremonies. The Santa Clara people, as well as many other indigenous tribes, have preserved the majority of their ancient traditions. We all share a history of oppression and injustice, but our identities have not faded, even in the face of multiple colonizing nations. Today, as always, we value our uniqueness and traditional way of life. At the same time, we live in modern houses and work and reside both on and off the reservation. Our beliefs and actions are still guided by our core Pueblo values, which include respect, compassion, faith, understanding, spirituality, balance, and peace. We continue to participate in our traditional celebrations and ceremonies throughout the year, maintaining our deep connection to our ancestors, nature, and Mother Earth. Santa Clara takes great pride in its rich legacy of pottery making. The Pueblo is known for its distinct handcrafted black and redware pottery, which is decorated with intricate engravings and precise designs. And I don't know if you're able to see, but here is a pot, a black pottery that was made by the drummer of the group, Mr. Eric Foya. And since time immemorial, Pueblo communities have celebrated seasonal cycles through prayer, song, and dance. These dances connect us to our ancestors while honoring gifts from the Creator. They ensure that life continues and that connection to the past and future are reinforced. They are not selfish prayers. We ask for guidance and blessings for all people throughout the world. Although we may not look the same, we are all brothers and sisters. So this dance group called Tewa Sunrisers of Santa Clara performed that evening, and the drummer, the head of the group, was led by Mr. Eric Tafoya, and my son Kevin Jenkins, along with Eric's children, performed the buffalo dance. And hopefully everybody enjoyed that piece of little entertainment, Robert. So what they witnessed was called the buffalo dance. Normally it's performed toward the end of the winter season, and that's to honor the animals that have given their lives to feed us, give us warmth, and clothe us. The dancers' regalia are made from actual animal parts. Our ancestors also learned to spin cotton, as you will notice from the kilts and dresses that are handmade. And that was a sacred dance, and that was to bless everyone there that came, and we wish them happiness, harmony, and health and prosperity on their journey of life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So for those who are listening, you can actually see the dance on the Critical Psychology website because the whole conference was recorded. But you can also see a screenshot from that performance included in the book as well. So up next, we have Fernanda, Valdit, and Jose from Brazil.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And thank you, my colleagues in this book, for the honor of being here with you. It's a pleasure and an honor to have our chapter presented here. So thank you very much. Valdit, Zé, and I are very, very enthusiastic about this. So we are going to present, and Zé is going to project for us. So let's see.
Can't you see?
Not yet. While we organize, I'll just say that our chapter talks about the creation of the viable unheard of as a revolutionary activity. This topic is very essential for us because as linguists and people who work with education, we have been dealing with Freire's idea of the viable unheard of throughout our experience as teacher educators, as teachers, and as researchers. So we are going to talk a little bit about this. And in order to say this, let's say who we are. So the next slide, please, Zé. We are a group that is part of the Catholic University of São Paulo, PUC, and this institution is the same one as Paulo Freire used to work, and we are considered a very revolutionary university because of the ideas we have been posing and how, as an institution, we have been fighting against all the oppression through all the years since we had the coup in the 60s and now again during these times of Bolsonaro's work. So we are going to talk a little bit about this and how we got support from different agencies. And as a part of a research group, we create a kind of research that is revolutionary and critical in itself. So what we are going to present here today is more like the praxis of our research group. So Val, it's up to you.
Okay, thank you. Broadly speaking, our research group, Language and Activity in the School Context, we call it GP-LACI, has its based on applied linguistic perspective, which chooses the school context to act and language as the core of its work. We develop critical collaborative intervention research, multilingual school context, and as a resistance expressive group, our theoretical frame is supported by Vygotskian discussions and also by the revolutionary transformative perspective in the Marxist theory. Go on, Zé.
Well, taking into account the current scenario in Brazil, right, in social and political areas, we have faced the reinforcements of injustice, segregation, prejudice, and the maintenance of the status quo. With the COVID-19 pandemic, this situation has gone even worse. Life conditions tend to decay rather than improve. And in many educational contexts, for example, questioning and finding ways to overcome constraints that limit one's existence have been understood as subversive activity instead of the legitimate critical role a citizen is entitled to in everyday life to nourish equality, well-being, the development of individuals, and collectivity in the country as stated in our Brazilian Constitution. So Val is going to tell us how we address that in the chapter.
Okay, as Fernanda said at the beginning, this chapter focuses on some of the activities developing the DigitMed program, one of the projects Leslie has developed since 2013 on de-encapsulating curriculum proposals to foster transformative agency. Here, we bring as a title the Freudian concept of the unviable unheard of. That means to go beyond the limiting situations posed by immediate reality whose strength is realizable solutions but not yet known or conceived. Fê, please.
Okay, as I don't know if you're seeing our projection, so anyway, I will continue with this. We are now going to give you an example of how this viable unheard of is created. We worked with the idea that in order to create a viable unheard of, we have to put together researchers, practitioners, students, everyone who are related to schools. So we invite different schools to join a project. The project is called DigitMed, and this project works as part of what we believe to be as a congregation of different realities. We have there students from very wealthy communities and very poor ones. We have deaf students, Haitian students, immigrants, and all kinds of people put together to think about curriculum development for schools in a collaborative way. In order to do this, we believe it's essential to have the immersion in reality, which means that we are going to engage with reality through art, through analyzing what the whole situation the students live in is. And in order to do that, they have to deal with the different context they live. So in this example that we present in our chapter, they were dealing with the problems with their communities, how the city where they lived or the neighborhood where they lived had different problems, and how they analyzed together with all their colleagues at school, see the situation in the school. So in the sense, the idea is that the development of the person needs to go through the process of immersion in reality first. And then we can move to what we call investigating social situations. In this sense, students were invited to think about the problems they had in their communities, but also to dream about the viable unheard of, to think about what they saw as possibilities to overcome that. And they wrote these things down. But we had as an idea for this project that they could have a discussion about the different ways of living in the city, how the city was occupied, how people who had no money, who had no homes lived. So we dealt with homeless people and how this could be connected to the idea of losing your dreams. Because recently in our city, we had a building which burned down, and we wanted them to have a connection with this situation, either if they were very rich or very poor, if they had never heard about it. How can you connect with real situations so that you can devise ideas on how to think about solutions for your own situations and problems? We really wanted this to be a critical experience that would make them go through a process of transformation and awareness. As Robert said in the beginning, conscientization was our first aim, that they could dive into reality, but also go up with the immersion, understanding critically and generally and historically the kinds of situations they went through. So they experienced, in a way, playing, which is something that Lois always talks about. They played with possibilities of thinking about this reality, and by doing so, they could connect what they live with a very broad situation. That is what we call in our idea here the construction and the connection to the immediate, connecting the immediate reality to social problems. When they do it, they can devise new possibilities for their own situation. They can think about themselves as agents of transformation, people who can devise revolution as their own ways of acting, as their own possibilities of being. And that's what they did, both by connecting to stories like the ones told by the Haitians about the hurricane they experienced, and talking about the building that burned down, talking about their own experience with deprivation and how they could overcome and find solutions, even if they were very limited ones, but solutions that they could work out. And this is the basis for our research group. And I want Zach to explain more about this and how this creates the basis for what we do as a research group and as people who want to change the world.
Well, thinking about pedagogical practice, right, as a revolutionary activity is essential to Lassi, as you could see in the explanation and in the pictures, right? As applied linguists and political agents working in different areas, Lassi directs this transformation of existing things towards the development of research and pedagogical language practices that can promote the dialogue between theory and practice and contemplate other ways of sociability, centralized, marginalized lives from social sciences. As Freire discusses, action and reflection are never apart in our everyday life. So this dialectic process is what makes people go beyond their immediate realities by doing what is possible to struggle with the obstacles they face in life. In other words, we are talking about people constantly moving towards transformation, which implies changes in the world through their individual and collective experience. Also, following the colonial practices, as stated by Sousa Santos, it is part of our work to capture this richness of diversity in social experience and the variety of forms of knowledge needed to build social emancipation. So this epistemological transformation, known as the epistemologies of the South, criticizes how globalization, capitalism, and as well as cognitive and social injustice reject an array of forms of knowledge as if they were not partial and situated resources for understanding reality. So this framework in Lassi is understood as a potential creative action to resist and expand, which is critically thought out so that participants can reason through what possibilities they have in order to perform activities they are involved. Fernanda?
So in order to conclude our presentation, what we want to say is that we are not only honored, but also we see this moment as a revolutionary one. Since for us, it's an opportunity to express the voices of the South. Together here, we have different people who can, with us, participate in this moment and bring our ideas as part of the ideas that can create possibilities to reflect about what research is and what critical psychology can be as praxis and not only as theory or practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all three of you. We listened to Brazil, now we listen to Chile. So we have Silvana and Connie up next.
Hi. We're very honored to follow the Brazilian group since we are also going to talk about something revolutionary and still ongoing. And I'm very happy that Robert allowed Silvana and I, two graduate students, to actually have a chapter in this book and reflecting upon what's going on in Chile, especially what is still ongoing in Chile. So our title is Student Resistance as Praxis Against Neoliberalism, a critical analysis of Chilean public education from 1980 to 2020. So introduction. The Chilean history, the history of Chilean education is the unequivocal expression of the country's political, socioeconomic, and cultural conditions. The multifaceted inequalities are bound to urban and rural settings, the tripartite schooling system, and the neoliberal policies that treat schools as yet another part of the market economy, what we are calling the market education. This is a study on education that explores interconnected links that confront a present grappling with its troubled past. By way of a new generation of students, hope for a brighter future is on the horizon. Our text provides a general account of Chilean public education, highlighting the milestones achieved by students. Since October 2019, high school students have become the vanguard in embodying a much-desired transformation, which translates as fierce resistance and conscious praxis. The future belongs to them. So as a historical political context of the Chilean education, we start in the 19th century. Public schooling had a political purpose, the formation of citizens, the consolidation of a national identity, and the fight against poverty. Although greater coverage across the territory became a necessity, this was limited and unequal, especially in the geographical regions most distant to the capital. In the 20th century, we saw the rise for demands for fairer access, equality, and free education for all. However, during the last years of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorial regime, a tripartite schooling system was created, which further aggravated social issues. During the transition to democracy, education became subordinated to municipal administration, which meant richer municipalities could provide for better conditions and infrastructure than underrepresented ones. Between private, subsidized, and public education, wealth was concentrated in the private education sector. As the state stepped back from being the guarantor of public education, the educational system had to, by force, become part of the market economy. Education became yet another consumer good. The constitutional right to a fair, quality, and free education was no longer guaranteed, but was determined by wealth and purchasing power. Schools have become corporations and families their clients. Neoliberalism as a vestiges of neocolonialism. So Chile has been labeled one of the most neoliberal countries in the world, and it is a place where most basic resources are privatized, including seawater. Chile possesses 100% privatized higher education system, where on average tuition costs $500 a month. an exorbitant amount that cannot be covered by the current minimum wage of roughly $420, the 320,500 pesos. The continual economic degradation and rampant inequality hits its peak on October 2019. Chileans took to the streets demanding the government to change the dictatorship constitution of 1980 to address the hikes in prices in water, electricity, and gas, among basic needs, and restructuring the public sector, which includes hospital, transportation, and of course, education. The protests are ongoing even under COVID-19. The neoliberal edifice in Chile has to crumble, but it is one deeply rooted in the vestiges of neocolonialism and foreign imperialism. As the recent article by Indian historian Vijay Prashad on the monthly reviews is aptly titled, "We're Witnessing Neoliberalism's Demise." He titled his article, "Neoliberalism was born in Chile and neoliberalism will die in Chile." Silvana?
Thank you, Connie. The neoliberal education policies were developed from the 1980s and advocate the privatization of all social services and the commodification of education. The effect of the market economy, neoliberal policies, and privatization begin to structure the family's responsibilities and learners around an educational market. On May of 1980, the Ministry of Education established the Municipalization of Education, which implied the transfer of school administration from the Ministry of Education to the municipality in which schools are located. This significantly widened the gap in terms of the quality of public education versus private. The richer municipalities distribute more resources to their schools in comparison to the poorer municipalities. In the 1990s, on the last day of the military dictatorship, the law LOCE was established. According to this law, complete freedom is granted to establishments to educate without basic regulatory measures. In this sense, education under private administration, financed with public money, may be entitled to generate profit. There lies the beginning of the market education. In 2006, Penguin Revolution was the first massive uprising by Chilean secondary school students demand the right to free and quality education. This was the long overdue response to Chilean privatized education, and until 2019 was considered the largest protest in the country's history. The Penguins group more than 1 million students who saw the repeal of the LOCE, the end of the municipalization and privatization of schools. This battle culminated in 2009 with the establishment of the General Education Law. This new law maintains educational commodification, but creates important modification in the admission processes, curriculum, and accreditation of educational establishments. The 2011 protests caught the world's attention when CONFECH, Confederation of Chilean Students, demand free education. The student protest unleashed a social movement that defied privatization and joined forces with the social organization that range from environmentalists to unions, but also include common folks. In October of 2019, the 30 pesos revolution began in response to an increase of 30 pesos in ticket price for the public transportation system in Santiago. The overall reaction to this measure gave hundreds of high school students the incentive to organize a mass sitting at metro station at the evade paying for the tickets. The massive evasion in Santiago's metro stations caused the shutdown of capital's entire underground transportation system. Far from uprising the situation in the capital, protests and demonstrations spread to 5 other regions of the country, and by October 23, a state of emergency had been declared in 15 of the 60 regional capitals. The declaration of a curfew was highly significant, as it was the first time since returning to democracy that it had been declared, this time for reason of civil disorder.
We'd like to end by reading what we wrote as a response to Robert's last question as a conclusion. Chilean student movements are revitalizing outbursts of resistance to an unending struggle against the overall socioeconomic inequality and the particular educational segregation in public schools. High school students voice demands that transcend educational frameworks and include in their needs on an entire nation that rebels against neoliberalism and the petrified policies dating back to Pinochet's dictatorship. Researchers in critical psychology have shown time and time again how dominant developmental psychology perspectives consider students as underage, uncritical, as a subject information, not ready to be agents of change. However, their fierce participation in protests in actually helping modify political dictates renders them key actors in long-awaited socioeconomic and political transformations. The social explosion of October 2019 rekindled the wounds left behind by decades of repression, but it also left multiple students, activists, blinded by rubber bullets or deceased from police brutality. Piñera's government perpetuated the well-known shock doctrine to student protests, criminalizing their voices and arresting them on false charges. Children, the youth, are agents of change, and their rise in these movements recognizes them as legal, autonomous agents, subjects who can critically reflect and participate in changing a nation, an example for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Silvana y Connie. Up next, we have Fu Wai, a critical psychologist based in Hong Kong. So make sure to unmute. Okay.
Is it okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you so much for invitation, Robert, and it's my great honor to speak here on behalf of situation in Hong Kong, and thanks for all the colleagues from all over the world to share your experience in the practice in critical psychology. And I would like to particularly thank Silvana and Connie, because you mentioned that student is the agency to change the whole situation, change the world, and students give us hope, and it's not just an object, and not it's just an object that need to follow the rules and need to harmonize and need to improve them. So they can be an agency. This is exactly the situation facing by Hong Kong, and I would like to share some recent development first. Okay. Oh, I would like to share the. So before I go on the discussion, let's see, this is the shape of Hong Kong. It's just like a frog. So we call our nickname is the frog. This is important with the discussion because we gradually talk about the new identity as a frog people, as a Hong Kong people. And recent situation is escalating because a majority of opposition leaders and those democratic councillors and legislators are arrested recently last week, and they are not allowed to take a buyout. So they are still waiting for the so-called court decision, but it is very pessimistic. And so many people go on to they try to support them, but eventually the police they charge them with some anti-pandemic regulation, something like this. So this is the very recent situation, and now the civil servants need to take an oath to claim that they are loyal to the new national security law, and soon it will be mandatory for all secondary school students, teachers, maybe from university. We don't know. We don't know which day we will have to face this situation. Those who fail to take the oath will ask to leave or to resign from the job. And in this chapter, I would like to divide into several sections. So I'll describe a little bit Hong Kong as a British colony, and at that time, in the 1970s in particular, the British colony tried to establish mythology called East West to try to cover up their neoliberalism policies and try to make this story as a success story, etc. But I would try to demonstrate that it is not as successful as it claims. Then after the returning of Hong Kong to China, the China tried to demonstrate to the world by the promise that there will have a one country, two system, and Hong Kong should be a special administrative region that have their own election and common law system. But now, of course, these promises are just forgotten, and the situation now they being escalated, and the election is cancelled, and the common law system is gradually more and more eroded by interpretation, and actually the national security law is not following the common law system. Which means that the decision could be very arbitrary, and actually no one knows what is the general principle underlying this law. And the pandemic situations makes a good excuse for example, lockdown, and there's no gathering for more than 2 people. So any kinds of gathering, any kinds of protests could be arrested due to pandemic regulation, etc. So this is the current situation. So in this chapter, I will talk a little bit about the following concepts. For example, the creation of East-West mythology in the 1970s. And then we gradually talk about after 1997, when Hong Kong is incorporated as a so-called special administrative region. So in the world's eye, Hong Kong still exists. But in Hong Kong people's eye, Hong Kong seems to be only part of the Chinese government, and it seems to be normal, but gradually Hong Kong people become more aware that their own situation, and they try to establish a new identity. So I try to demonstrate with some concepts, maybe from Lacan's separation. That means that not separate, but partition from inside. So this term actually describes the situation faced by Hong Kong people. So according to ethnicity, of course, Hong Kong people has a very close relationship in history with China, of course, and Han ethnicity. But the rules from colonial days makes this a little bit separate. But interestingly, in the colonial days, Hong Kong people still identify themselves as a part of Chinese community, and they identify themselves as Chinese Hong Kong people. But gradually after the current situation, then in the chapter, I will describe a little bit about the progress from East-West mythology. This is presented in mainstream psychology as well. Then gradually Hong Kong, there's an evolution that they have self-awareness that Cantonese provinces, which is in the south, is a bit opposite to the North culture, Northern Chinese culture, which is meaning from Beijing or Shanghai, etc. And then gradually we even try to separate from the south from the Canton provinces, and we try to find their own identity, which is represented in recent social movement that we try to establish a new identity that is not even belong to Cantonese or not belong to Canton provinces, but we want to have an identity of our own. And we use the PP as the identity, as a symbol for identity. So PP is the fork actually. We understand in the chapter we describe that PP maybe in North America is not a good symbol because sometimes it's used by left-wing communities, and even the author is himself tried to not to use this icon anymore. But ironically, in Hong Kong, because the shape of Hong Kong is like a frog, so some people eventually try to find out this frog as the symbol of resistance, and so that's why nowadays, if a shop, they show some icons of the PP frog for the Hong Kong peg, for example. It seems to be, then we can see that this shop or this restaurant is trying to be pro-democratic, and they use this symbol as a language to communicate with each other. And gradually we try to replace every kinds of Chinese rituals. For example, in the Chinese New Year, people give the red packet usually, but then we try to use the color, which is yellow, to replace the original red color, because red color is the color that adopted by Communist Party in China. So we try to gradually move onward to replace any symbolic meanings of even from colors and the icons to replace the original traditional Chinese culture. So gradually, Hong Kong people try to establish their own identity. So in this chapter, we will talk about the history and talk about some concepts we borrow from Lacan's Subversion. And I try to compare this concept with Asian Chinese concept with from Gongshun, which is at the time of Aristotle. So it was a very Asian scholar in China who is often ignored because of his progressive and because of historic position. For example, he gives the proposition that there is no one who, or there's the proposition of white horse is not a horse, which is represented in the chapter. So this definitely describes the situation in Hong Kong. If Hong Kong and China is from Hong Kong people's eyes regarded as two places, not one place anymore, then there's no point talking about oneness. So this is the position in these papers, and I will try to describe this situation. And also I will try to think clearly about the possibility from, for example, Lacan's concept long to bear. And in Hong Kong, it seems that the name of Bear, the father, it is more likely that, because in Hong Kong, Communist Party is calling themselves grandparents. So in Hong Kong, the name of grandparents is something that you cannot challenge this grandparents' rule, etc., etc. So even though we never know that who is the grandparent and what is the real meaning of the orders, you need to guess from the newspapers, and you need to guess what is the real intention of every words that is became from the president, etc. So these are the key terms in my chapters. And finally, I will attach some report of the situation of mainstream psychology, who try to in defense of the government. So mainstream psychology often say that it is the youngsters because they are feeling angry with the economic situation, or feel angry with the lack of upward movement, upward mobility, etc. So they try to normalize this kind of protest as kind of resentment towards economy. And for example, they even in articles I mentioned that some mainstream psychologists try to say that this event, who is a fight, actually the villagers try to beat the protesters with some kinds of weapons, and they try to normalize this event and say that there is no evidence to say that this is something necessary done by the villagers, something like this. So I will report some situation in mainstream psychology in Hong Kong that they try to promote what they call harmony within the generations, and they try to promote that we should live in a place in a harmony and try to normalize all these kind of events as just a form of economical resentment. But in the lastly, I will talk about that in this chapter, actually, all the mainstream psychology overlook the situation that now Hong Kong is becoming shifting from North versus South, which is the contrast between the Northern culture and the Southern culture. Gradually becomes a North versus Hong Kong. And Hong Kong nowadays becomes an autonomy agency, and they have their own identity. We try to live on their own culture and identity, even though the social situation is very harsh and is under oppression. But gradually, Hong Kong people try to establish their own economical circles and try to establish their own agency to fight against the oppressions. Of course, the situation is still very harsh, and the situation is still continuing, and it seems that the resistance is very difficult, but still there are hopes that once, because in the last sentence of the book, I'll try to share with you all. So the last sentence in the book. So thanks, Robert, for bringing the idea. This is where the PP was. I must come into being. So this describes the situation and the dream of Hong Kong people. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Fu Wai. Last but not least, my esteemed colleague, Tommy Curry, who is coming through Edinburgh. And then his speech will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So make sure to save your questions till the end, and I'll look at them at the YouTube chat. And then after the Q&A session, I'll present my intro because it was missed in the beginning. So Tommy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert. My chapter really extends a larger criticism that I've made about Black feminist interpretations of Black masculinity and the deployment of intersectionality in the interpretation of Black men and boys. Specifically, looking at the intervention I made in The Man Not in 2017, I suggested that one of the things we've missed in intersectionality is the way that it's utilized the concept of the woman that was introduced by Catherine McKinnon and her dominance theory back in the 1980s. Now, while many people think of intersectionality as a liberatory theory that can be applied in a myriad of ways, one of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw is very clear about is that she was influenced by the work of Catherine McKinnon, and that in combination with the work of Derek Bell. Specifically, it's this question of vulnerability, this universal vulnerability that all women have to rape and male violence, that becomes so important for her work, something that she wants to utilize throughout mapping the margins in her understanding of domestic abuse and sexual assault. And of course, the way that this suggests then that once you understand the vulnerability of women in that way, the vulnerability to rape, to domestic abuse, to sexual assault then requires Black men to operate in the Black community as rapists, as assaulters, and as perpetrators. What I'm interested in understanding here then is how intersectionality perpetuates a few problems. The first is a question of continuity, or how intersectional analysis doesn't really change any of the previous literature interpretations of Black men and boys that we get from the 1960s to now. In doing so, it brings about a second problem, which is replication, or how previously racist theories like the subculture violence theory, which was authored by Wolfgang and Ferracuti, becomes something that's compatible and parallel with the kinds of theories that are being introduced as intersectional today. And the third, of course, is the question of pathology, or how the frameworks or the outgrowth of intersectional analysis seems to simply pathologize Black men as violent and sexually aggressive. These three crises or three themes give us a problem with simultaneity. And what I mean by that is that while intersectionality may reveal lots of different ways to understand race, class, and gender throughout various groups, whenever you decide a vulnerability of a female group, it requires a kind of fixity, a stasis with what the male group becomes. So in any situation where you say that Black women or brown women are victims to sexual assault and violence, you don't have an intersectional analysis of men, because once that intersectional analysis happens on women, the men become fixed. They are the perpetrators of violence. So the question then arises, well, how then can intersectionality be useful for how we study Black men? Or more importantly, what kind of assumptions are we making in deploying this in the analysis of Black masculinity, or our analysis of Black masculinity? The empirical evidence overwhelmingly shows that Black males simply lack structural power over Black women in American society. But what's interesting is that many of the intersectional analysis that concern Black male privilege and Black male patriarchy seem to focus on the physical threats that Black males are thought to pose to Black female, queer, and trans bodies interpersonally, rather than things like systematic advantages in employment, economic mobility, or wealth. So what my article tried to do was understand how Black male patriarchy through or how does the understanding of Black male patriarchy through violence with intersectional analysis become a product, right, of Black feminism's reliance on subculture violence theory, and ultimately what came to be understood as racial sexual stratification within minority groups. So I'm arguing that the criminological formulation of Black maleness as a threat to women explains this seemingly fixed perspective in intersectional analyses on the sexual pathology and the social deviance of Black men and boys. Now, what's fascinating about this, of course, is that, you know, once you start thinking about intersectionality, the intuitive reaction, the gut reaction is that this is liberatory, right? That when we talk about this, this could be a system that could be used for everyone. But what I'm suggesting is something much more nuanced in the actual citations that we get from Crenshaw. The first thing is to understand what a subculture of violence actually is. So Wolfgang and Ferracuti think of subcultures of violence that are as subcultures that simply suggest that there's a potent theme of violence in the current cluster of the values of that group. It makes up the lifestyle, the socialization process, and their interpersonal relationships. Now, in 1967, the idea here was that racial differences were more important indicators of violence like homicide or intimate partner violence than gender differences. So even though people linked physical aggression to the issue of masculinity and toughness, the idea in the 1960s was that because Black men were not thought to be men at all, right, that they were thought to actually be quite effeminate and female-like, that Black women actually took the head of household role. So in the 1960s, many of the disproportionate rates of intimate partner homicide that you found in the Black community were explained away by the idea that Black women killed Black men at higher rates because Black men were actually more feminine. Now, in the 1970s, specifically 1971, Menenchem Amir, who was the student of Wolfgang and Ferracuti, drew up another theory in a book called Forcible Patterns of Rape. And what he wanted to suggest was that Black masculinity is fundamentally sexually pathological. He actually argues that the Negro male's aggressive sexuality seems to be more problematically due to the strong need to overcome problems of masculinity and sexual identity. Now, of course, he brings this about because he thinks that the Negro family structure is mother-based and that Black men can't be taught to be proper civil patriarchs. But he nonetheless thinks that this is a function of the Black subculture, right? That Negro subculture is historically unique because it embodies both the characteristics of lower-class subculture, but a more pronounced and savage form of sexual aggression and rape. Now, this is one of the first times that you're actually getting criminology to articulate a system of thinking about rape and about Black male sexuality that breathes this into a specific and different subculture. The difference between how Crenshaw utilizes this theory and how other feminists utilize these theories will become evident in a moment. But what's important here is that the idea of the subculture that's being brought about was that all Negro subculture is sexually violent and sexually aggressive. It's just that Black men end up being the rapists, but Black mothers are in fact teaching Black men to be aggressive. But feminists take this up in the early 1970s. Of course, you have people like Susan Brown Miller who are interpreting Black males through Wolfgang's subculture violence theory. In fact, she says that one of the major contributions that you get from Wolfgang is that you can see that the dominant culture operates within laws of civility because it has little need to resort to violence when it wants, but that the subculture, because it's thwarted, inarticulate, and angry, right? And she links this, of course, to being disenfranchised, poor, of the lower class, or Black, right, and male, right? That it quickly resorts to violence, right? And then violence and physical aggression become a common way of life. But Brown Miller doesn't stop there. She actually brings into the idea of subcultural violence theory this notion of rape. It plays a huge part in how she's dealing with and theorizing masculinity in her 1970 book, Against Her Will. This is why she says that she thinks that the single most important contribution of Muir's study was that to place the rapist squarely within the subculture of violence, right? That the rapist becomes normal. And this becomes especially important for how we think about Black males. This theory is continued by Bell Hooks in her book, We Real Cool, where she talks about Black males, particularly young Black males, as having a unique sexually aggressive subculture. And ultimately, this is how she tries to rationalize the Central Park Five. But what's most important here is that once you get these kind of theories that are being utilized by white feminism and early Black feminists in the late 70s and 1980s, you also see this idea of Black men morphing, that, well, Black men are not just a reflection of Negro subculture, that they're a particular subculture in and of themselves. And this is particularly due to the work of someone named Lene Curtis in 1976. Now, Lene Curtis's work wanted to suggest that, well, when you start looking at Black men, the real issue is that they develop a uniquely violent subculture. And this is how he explained the higher rates of rape, that because they're a contraculture where they learn from the dominant white male society, they actually change the notions of patriarchy, make it more dangerous and distorted, right? And it's this danger and distortion that creates this kind of hypersexual and more aggressive rapists than we see even in white men. But Kimberly Crenshaw cites this work in 1991. In a footnote to Mapping the Margins, she actually writes, for example, the use of rape to legitimize efforts to control and discipline the Black community is well established in the historical literature on rape and race. Now, she only quotes Joyce E. Williams and Karen's home book, The Second Assault, from 1981. The problem is, this was one of the first texts to ever introduce the idea that Black men were naturally rapists because of compensatory masculinity. So it was anything but well established during this period of time. In fact, the whole idea of racial sexual stratification was that the way that patriarchy operates in the white group can be theorized to operate the same way in the Black and the Mexican American group. And the only reason that this was the case was not because there was ever any evidence of patriarchy amongst these men, but simply because these men were thought to be rapists. So intersectionality then focuses on a notion of rape as the basis of control and compensatory masculinity, the idea that because Black men are oppressed, they compensate through violence, sexual aggression, and rape. And that becomes a way that she's trying to articulate what she thinks is the basis of rape functioning in Black society. The problem, of course, is that there's no sociological evidence to support this. When we look at CDC reports or even the occurrence of rape and sexual assault in Black communities, we find that young Black boys are actually assaulted more and earlier than their Black female counterparts. And that even when we look at CDC comparisons from NISVS data on occurrences of rape and contact sexual victimization, these numbers are very similar, with Black men actually showing higher 12-month prevalence. So what Black male studies is trying to do is trying to unravel some of the pathologies that we've assumed belongs to the male category, and really trying to expose, or rather demystify and decolonize, how the male category actually sneaks in a lot of racist subculture violence theories that still assume that Black men are savages, Black men are rapists, and they're sexually predatory, simply by calling it gender theory. So the challenge that this chapter is trying to wage is not simply that intersectionality is incorrect. I think lots of the empirical evidence suggests that, but it's trying to show how the intellectual history, the assumptions that Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, is utilizing from mainstream white feminists, be they Susan Brown Miller or The Second Assault by Williams and Holmes, actually brings in criminological theories to justify and back up the assumptions about Black men committing and perpetrating violence within the Black community. So I think that's my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tommy. So we have now time for some questions and answers session. I know there's some lag with the YouTube live stream, so while the attendees catch up, I'll start try to summarize some of the major themes because I think this is the first time all of you got to listen to each other's papers, right? So you get a sense of what the book is like, and not just being focused on your own chapter. And so one of the things I'm really proud of is this praxis of psychosocial non-alignment to modernity coloniality, which is the subtitle of the book. And this is evident really, particularly with the examples from the global south. So Chile, Brazil, Turkey, Hong Kong, right? And also focusing on, because it's not just a question of the global south, but also a question of decoloniality in the global north. So, which is the question of indigenous, Black, and racialized folks in the global north as well, right? So there's clearly a focus on, resistance movements or practices and theories of resistance, not just to knowledge, but to just oppressive systems more generally, right? So that's kind of like an overall theme that I think ties a lot of the chapters together. There are some other interesting alignments in terms of theory, whether it's critical pedagogy, in the case of Chile, Brazil, Lois's chapter, or the Marxist question, and also psychoanalysis. So that's something we see in Michael and Fuai as well. So I want to start with a question that kind of ties in, I think, Tommy's and Michael's chapters, which is this critique of mirroring or critique of mimicry, or to use, Lacanese, imaginary identification. That's something that's a common thread in both chapters. So in Tommy's case, is this assumption that, Black males internalize basically white supremacist patriarchy. And that's what explains the myth of the rapist. So, and that's something that, Tommy pushes back against with Black male studies and in terms of decolonizing intersectionality. But also Michael pushes back at this with this identification with mastery. So if Tommy and Michael could reflect on that kind of resonance between both of your chapters, that critique of mirroring or mimicking or imaginary identification.
Tommy, you want to go ahead?
Okay, I was trying to give the floor to you. Well, I think, in my previous work, one of the major flaws I find with Western feminism, both white and Black, is the idea of mimesis, right? Or what I say is the memetic crisis of gender theory. This assumption really started in the 1960s, could be traced earlier if you're going to come up some of the colonial texts, but arguably the 1960s around the development of a notion of compensatory masculinity. The idea there is that because there is only one patriarch, lesser groups of men seek to imitate white men. Now we see similar theories around the Russia-Japanese War in 1904, where you start getting arguments suggesting that the Japanese are really Western, they're fighting men, because the idea is that the only way you could be a fighting man is to be really a white man. So then they said, oh, back in the day, Aryans must have had sex with people in Asia to produce the Japanese, right? So these are the kinds of colonial theories that made sense at the birth of the 20th century. In the mid-20th century, which is the time period that I'm working with in this paper, what you see is this theorization that Black men can't have another culture. And because within Black society, you see higher rates of violence, the idea was that there's a savagery there, that all Black people are savages. Black women kill their children, Black men kill their women, Black women kill their men. This is just how the culture is. This is the psychology of segregation if you're following someone like John Dollard. What I'm trying to point out here is that this notion of compensatory masculinity is not factually based at all. Right. So what we've done is we've utilized the notion of hypermasculinity, hypersexuality, even compensatory masculinity, and how we talk about toxic masculinity, etc., that has no basis in literature. There is no scientific study that documents any of this. In fact, the earliest studies that are looking at hegemonic masculinity or toxic masculinity say the most significant independent variable is alcoholism, has nothing to do with racial traits or racial characteristics. So what we've done now is we've created a whole field of gender studies that says, let's start reading disproportionate rates of violence in Black Black communities as a function of masculinity and toxicity. But what you do is you've already excluded, there's a huge selection bias here. You've already excluded the kinds of violence that you see throughout neighborhoods. You've excluded the violence that you see women perpetuate. You've excluded communal violence. You excluded previous exposure to trauma, etc. And you focused on one group. And you're saying that the full explanatory power of the perpetration of violence of Black men, straight Black men, comes simply from them being masculine. And because they're oppressed, right? This is the interesting part. Because they're oppressed, they try to compensate by imitating their oppressor. Whereas every other Black group that's oppressed tries to compensate by creating revolutionary humanist values. There's no evidence for this claim whatsoever. The same kind of violence you see in Black households amongst Black men in 1965, because that's where you get the first national survey of domestic violence and interpartner homicide, is the same kind of violence you're going to see amongst Black women. In fact, from 1976 to 1991, Black women had higher rates of killing their spouses. We have no explanation for it. So we've made up theories that simply imitate the ongoing discourses and ideological patterns that we find in white feminism. We've mirrored that and said that it's Black and it's feminist, so it's intersectional. And then because it's intersectional, no one can simply question it, despite the kind of evidence and the citation count that shows it comes from extremely problematic views. This chapter is just trying to open up and show what actual scholarship does. We trace both the genealogy of the term and then compare that genealogy to the empirical record.
I just kind of want to keep listening. I'm really, I'm really fascinated with this. Thank you. I'm not sure, that from the Lacanian point of view, Lacan was, especially in the first half of his career, really focused on, I think, something that at least overlaps with what Tommy is talking about, which was like he was trying to kind of decenter the role of identification for psychoanalysis. Like his initial big critique was that psychoanalysis had become a culture of not only sort of just basic kind of imaginary image-based identifications with Freud, but a system in which analysts kind of reproduced their sets of identifications through their analyseums, so that the idea was that if you want to be a healthy analyzed person, you have to, and this is in the literature, identify with the healthy parts of the ego of the analyst, right? And internalize them and become like them. So this was really held out as sort of a good thing. And so Lacan was sort of railing against this and pointing out that like a Freudian reading of that is that it's a sort of narcissistic and kind of violent propagation of maybe kind of like Tommy's pointing out, a really unsatisfactory notion of subjectivity, right? A very like two-dimensional kind of idea, and one that's not borne out. I'm sure Lacan wouldn't turn to empirical research, but one that's not borne out in the complexity of one's subjectivity and in the unconscious and that kind of a thing. And I guess, Tommy, your comments are kind of making me think about how that kind of, so my critique is that same problem infects Lacanianism, but I'm just thinking about sort of the current political moment. And obviously, like, intersectionality is a really sort of hot button idea right now, more and more in pop culture. And there's a huge turn in popular discourse toward identification, right? Like toward beginning comments with "I identify as," and like in the world of psychology and psychoanalysis right now, sort of contemporary relational psychoanalysis especially, there's a real practice that's emerging of trying to arrange patients with therapists based on mutual identifications. So patient says, I identify as, A, B, and C, and I'm looking for a therapist who identifies as, maybe some of those, maybe something else. And there's this kind of matchmaking that goes on in the clinical world more and more. So I guess I'm curious about like your thoughts about how identification and maybe we can talk more offline about this. I don't know if there's time, but how identification is working in the current social justice movement, both for and against sort of kind of like a fuller understanding or a fuller speech act, or of people's situations, people's subjectivity.
Yeah, thank you both for those reflections. So I have a question from Alfonso Williams, and I'll direct the question to Serdar, Fouay, and Lois. So does everyone feel the research is receiving the attention it deserves by their peers moving forward? I know some mentioned operating on the margins, which is a powerful statement in itself. Also, without these critical interventions being presented here, where does everyone see mainstream psychology heading on its current trajectory?
I can speak. Again, it's mainstream equals a more and more U.S. and European, or British, in fact, approach that is becoming more and more global. I think that it's headed, on the one hand, in the direction of more and more reductionistic, medicalized, and individuated understandings, like digging its heels into its insistence that it knows and that it can predict. And on the other hand, I think that the co-optation of some what used to be radical ideas, postmodern ideas, critical ideas, and practices, performative, qualitative methods, like all of the things that were on the margins, have become much more integrated and co-opted so that they are now still within the framework of the natural science predictive model. So why did I say a second direction? So those are two ways, because there is still such great unhappiness. So more and more practitioners, for example, of let's stop the research. Talking about practitioners of a therapeutic model, for example, are more and more outside that mainstream, and and I just see an incredible openness. And unlike the last speaker about the identity politics of psychology and looking for therapists, there is equally a move for diversity and a recognition that the more people are unlike you, the more you can continue to create yourself by seeing yourself in the other. So that's what I think.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely, go ahead.
There are two ways to respond to this. Mainstream psychology is difficult to define. It's amorphous. There are multiple organizations, forces in it. Therefore, the first option is to follow the money. Mainstream psychology follows the money. So if it is a conservative government, or if it's the dictatorship, let's say under Sisi in Egypt, mainstream psychology will conform. And my chapter basically argues that psychology is a managerial discipline that serves the neoliberal order. So that's about the money. Secondly, if you want stronger evidence, because the first option is also difficult to follow. How do you follow the money? But the second one is easier to do. Find organizations that represent mainstream psychology. So that would be APA in the US, in North America, and EFPA, European Federation of Psychological Associations in Europe. And don't go further than the website. Take a look at the website, what the website contains, etc., etc. So the collusion of the American Psychological Association with the military and the Bush regime was because APA wanted more money. And just like Dick Cheney, who made money out of Iraq, APA made money out of these military operations. So there is now a field, as they call it, of deployment psychology. There is a center for deployment psychology, etc. So all of this basically is their way of making money. But I'll give you one more example, more recent. After the killing of George Floyd, one of the very first statements that the American Psychological Association produced recommended more psychologists in the police force or as consultants. So to every single problem that leads to huge suffering, unacceptable suffering, inhumanity, you call it the way you want to call it. They basically produce the same answer. More psychologists needed. So more psychologists in Afghanistan, more psychologists in the Pentagon, more psychologists in the CIA, more psychologists there and everywhere. That's the basic response. So my response to that is more psychologists everywhere doesn't end the suffering. The root of the suffering is elsewhere. More psychologists does not end racism. There will be more killings of George Floyds in the US because the system is there. Thank you.
Suwai?
Thank you for your question. To me, what is mainstream psychology is the trend that try to reduce psychology as a skills of stress management or something, or to try to reduce any kinds of protest as a form of improper management of anger. Take Hong Kong as an example. For example, after the social protest, the themes for the research funding this year is to understand young people. So majority of the mainstream psychology to get the funding are working on stress management or career counseling or something like this. They try to normalize the protest as a form of insecurity or some kind of insecurity of own future or career or something. They try to reduce everything in some very dissected manner and try to reduce psychology as kind of skills rather than a system of thought, or try to reduce psychology as a kind of intervention. But what they mean as intervention is not something political. Definitely is a political situation for mainstream psychologists. And by doing so, the mainstream psychology is trying to give us a phantom solution to social inequality and the oppression, and try to make a phantom solution for parents to give some false hope as if psychologists can give the panacea for all social problems. But it is actually none in those mainstream psychologists, because by following the logical positivism manner that we have to use the hypothetical deductive manner, then we have to work on the same research question and again. So actually, if you find that in the literature review, majority of the so-called new research papers, the hypothesis is a slight modification of the old hypothesis, and eventually come to nowhere and very decontextualized to the paint and the situation about our own identity, for example, or they ignore any issues of, for example, intersectionality, for example. This is all omitted in the mainstream psychology, at least in Hong Kong.
Thank you, all three. The next question is for the Brazil and Chile groups. And it's from Svetlana. So what is your view of universities' sense and purpose? What are they for? I mean, if these are not for neoliberalism, hence not for capitalist utility, learning something business useful. So let's start with Brazil and then Chile.
Well, I can start first and then Fernanda can go on. As for Lassi, this project that we address in the chapter, there is a community built considering the university, schools that were involved in the process as participants, and engaging, right, these different groups together in this diversity context. So when we think of teachers, professors, masters, students in master's degrees, doctorates, children in school, we are thinking of all these people together trying to get engaged for this revolutionary activity that we're calling it here. So university in this case is, of course, the place where not only the place where these people were going to meet, but it was together with them trying to promote these challenges and facing this reality. But taking the colonial perspective, we are thinking of people that are collaborative, working together. Fernanda can add more about that too.
Yeah, and I think that what we've been trying to do, as Zé was saying, is we read not only the North or whatever it is, the Eurocentric perspectives of how life is organized, but we try hard to work with different possibilities of understanding. And one of them is the possibility of the participants in the project. So they come to the meetings, they come to our classes, depending on what we are doing, they come to conferences with us. We try to break the boundaries of what academic world is and real life outside the academy is, because otherwise there is no way we can change both. And as someone mentioned in the question on the YouTube chat, we are trying not to create the global South as something that is going to substitute the North, but we want to create something that is new, that integrates everyone. But of course, it's necessary that we Brazilians talk to our friends in Chile and in other places, and not only to the Europeans and to the North Americans, because that's the normal situation. We normally we bend our heads to the North, and what we want to do is to have a very close conversation with the North, but also with our friends that have similar situations, similar contexts of living. So, and the university, I think, is a place where this can happen. So we have to use the spaces we have. We are not talking about this descolonization. We're talking about decolonizing. Decolonization, that means that we accept that we live in a colonized way. Our minds are colonized. So how can we change from within? That's the idea.
So Val or Connie or Silvana?
I'll go ahead. Well, the role of the university, or the purpose of the university as repositories and generators of knowledge, I think at this day and age, we can't just think of those places as such. There's a clear capitalistic aspect to universities, and making money and having a certain amount of enrollments, having enough funding for certain departments and not others, those that will make and generate more money, and clear inequality, especially in the US with, oh, and we have Fred joining us too, a clear inequality in terms of the amount of funding that is given, for instance, to sports teams, or athletics compared to the humanities, for instance. So there is a very capitalistic game that keeps shrinking the humanities, for instance. In my field of philosophy, sorry, I'm dealing with a cat at the same time. But for instance, in Chile, we have a very strong movement of student leaders in universities that have been continuously politically engaged for a very long time. I mean, this traces even back from the times of Allende, and they were very popular and strong back then. But even before then, the student leaders often make it to parliament, elected as officials in parliament, and are supported by the people. So I'm very interested in Silvana's take, since she is back in Chile and I'm in the US, so it's a different picture.
Yeah. In this sense, personally, of the university is like a platform to spread and share knowledge, not only to achieve a profession or a job or do research, but for the pleasure of sharing an interest in common theme, which allow us to coexist and learn from others with others, based on criticism, reflection, and community work. But in the end, the final purpose could be to contribute to the social change. And that is what the student movements have taught us in Chile, at least.
Thank you very much. I want to end with the panelists asking each other questions if they want to. So I'll begin with Rachel. If you want to ask anyone else a question about their paper, something you're interested to learn more about, or something you appreciated, you can go ahead. And then if other panelists want to ask someone else that presented a question. So Rachel, you're muted. Sorry. Make sure to.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I'm not a psychology person, or but I really appreciate being here, and I find it really interesting. And Silvana, I mean, I know a little bit about what's happening in your part of the country, and it's just fascinating to see that you're with us, and you're studying all this, and Connie as well, and I'm just grateful to be here. Thank you. That's all, Robert.
Thank you. Does anyone want to ask any of the other panelists a question? Okay, Fernanda, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to ask Raquel about Rachel or Raquel, I don't know. Well, anyway, how she sees the voices of the indigenous people or Native Americans, or like we here, we are very interested in bringing to our research and to our ways of reading the world the perspectives of indigenous people in Brazil, of the African traditions in Brazil, brought from these different perspectives. And I would like to know how you see yourself as someone who's trying to contribute to open the views that people have from this perspective. Well, we are not psychologists either. We are educators. So I would love to hear from you.
Well, being Native, am I on? Yeah. Okay, being Native, I feel like I live in two worlds. I live in our Native American world and the Western. And I feel like I had to learn to balance myself, because when I come home to the reservation, we have our ceremonial activities, and it's like I feel like I'm really unique, because I'm able to participate and through our dances and And, it's like I had mentioned in the book that, our prayers are for everybody, not just for us. It's for the world. And it's really sad to see what's going on, now everywhere, and then especially with this pandemic. But that also tells me too that what my ancestors, what my mother, what my grandmother have kind of predicted is that, because there's no respect, for one thing, is what our elders tell us. There's no respect in the world anymore. That's why it is the way it is. And it's kind of true because, like my mother says that her parents told her that one day there was not going to be respect. Everything was just going to be out of balance. And I see it now, so like I said, it's within myself. I have to find, like, I live in two worlds, I'm out here at work, and then, in the Western world, and then I come back to my reservation and I feel more at peace and more, just with prayers, trying to find a balance that, everything will one day maybe come together, and everybody will be at peace, which is, I don't know if that'll happen, but hopefully someday. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Lois, I know you have a question. Go ahead.
Actually, it's a question for you, Robert. In your opening, in your chapter, in your talk, in your opening remarks, which not everyone's heard, so I'm glad you're going to repeat them. I learned a lot from them. But one of the things you said was, after you showed some maps, then you were of the world, you were talking about the need to, I don't know what word you used, if you used the word need, but to map the complexity that is human subjectivity. So why would you want to do that? I mean, given the nearly universal proclivity to take the map for what it's mapping, and the actuality that whatever the map shows is a distortion of what it's mapping, why would you want to map the complexity of human subjectivity? And what do you, I assume you do, and if you do, in what ways do you understand that having an important contribution to make to the revolutionary transformation of the world?
Thank you. So obviously I'm using map here metaphorically, right? So just by the fact that we speak about subjectivity, it's already a form of mapping or reduction. So that's what I mean. And so by us writing, chapters, by us presenting, we're already reducing complexity. So the question for me is, how do we reduce complexity without completely distorting what we're trying to represent? So this is really the question that I'm interested in. So I showed 3 maps, and the third one is still a 2-dimensional map, the orthograph, but it's the most accurate 2-dimensional representation of a complex 3-dimensional reality. So, it cannot replace the original thing. There's always the question of, representation, linguistic representation. It's just a question of, well, how do we honor that complexity? And I think what I try to do, honestly, with the whole book, like the vision, if we think about it, like when Rachel said, I'm not a psychologist, and then Fernanda said, well, I'm not a psychologist, I'm an educator. That's the whole point, is the critical psychological perspective is to, move towards transdisciplinarity, to draw on different disciplines, and to also introduce new theories. And that's kind of to freshen the perspective. So by inviting Tommy and bringing in Black male studies, something that's never been introduced to critical psychology before, it does something different. It shows us something that we were not seeing before. And that's part of that mapping, I would say, like decolonial mapping project. Right? Now, is it going to be perfect? No, but we can strive to be as accurate as possible. I think that's not a bad thing as a goal.
Okay.
Any other questions for fellow panelists?
I have one for Lois.
Please go ahead.
So just your comments, Lois, about mainstream psychology co-opting some of the, taming some of the voices of whatever critique, qualitative methods or more philosophically informed approaches, human science approaches, kind of resonated with me because, like, I run an internship and I try to teach that stuff to people who have not had exposure to it. So sort of the secret agenda of like the one of them to my program is to try to bring people who are trained in mainstream psychology into a place where they can, learn these other perspectives. So, but I hear what you're saying. I recently was showing them some of, phenomenology from the 80s, and I realized how unradical it seems now, right? It's been very much kind of taken up into some of the stuff that these guys are learning, same thing, like they'll recognize things from individualized assessment that was based in phenomenology as part of current like therapeutic assessment, so anyway, my question to you is like, how should we want psychology or psychologists to respond to what has been radical critique or like just an otherness, addressing it or trying to push it in another direction? Like, what do you think the sweet spot is that isn't taming or co-opting?
Yeah. Well, I think Robert's onto something with that, and especially in the, well, I still don't agree with the mapping part of it, with the transdisciplinariness of it. So, for example, where I see those once radical approaches and ideas alive as radical is outside of psychology. I mean, psychology is so adept at co-opting. And perhaps it is because it's such a big business, while some of the other academic disciplines are just not that big, like philosophy. I mean, they don't make, it's just not a business the way it is a business, but it's not a business in the same way psychology is, for example. So that, or history, that I see the bringing in other crossing disciplines, getting away with that. So there's a whole grouping of relational phenomenologists, and I don't think any of them are psychologists. I think psychology is one of the most conservative. So I think kind of reminding people, I guess, of how does this meet people's needs? And in talking, in addressing what you're saying about the interns and how as you're teaching, and for you, these were radical things, and now they're not radical. And like, do they care? How do you bring the history? And I mean, Tommy just gave us an incredible history lesson, and we were all interested. But so I think it's a real challenge of how do you make history creatively important to people and have them own it. I don't know.
Thank you both. Any others that want to question fellow panelists or comment? Okay, so it looks like that ends the Q&A session. So feel free if you want to leave. I'm going to have to repeat my introduction because it wasn't recorded. So thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think it was wonderful. So
thanks very much. Great to meet all of you.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, so I'm gonna repeat my intro because it was missed in the beginning, and I want it to be recorded. So I will begin with this image is actually a view in New Mexico, where I'm based. Okay, let's see. So this is the coupon for getting 20% off if you purchase the book directly from Routledge and you enter SMA01, you get 20% off the book. So what I did in the beginning is I gave some background as to how the book came together. So I'll just preface that before kind of talking about my chapter. So I started creating the criticalpsychology.org website in 2018. And basically, I wanted it to be a free resource for scholars, activists, and practitioners who are interested in critical psychology. Mainly tried to imagine myself when I was a graduate student that I didn't have a resource like that to guide me through the literature. And so I took it upon myself to create that. And of course, it's a work in progress, so anyone can email me with suggestions for things to add. But I have I have a kind of a worldly vision of critical psychology, so I tend to think of it as critical world psychology. So I try to draw from different theoretical resources and different disciplines, and I think this is evident in today's event and the book that represents that. So I encourage you to visit the website, especially click on 2019 ICPPC. So that stands for the International Critical Psychology Praxis Congress, which took place at Northern New Mexico College in 2019. And you can see pictures on the left pre-COVID. We had a great time, and many of today's presenters were at the conference. If you click on that link, 2019 ICPPC, which is a page on the website, you can actually watch recorded videos from the conference and learn more about that event. This book is not just a book of conference proceedings. It's more than that. But this is kind of the origin, the inception of the idea. So this is the cover of the book. As you can see, this is a logo that I designed, which is the symbol for psychology, psi, but I bar it, so you can read it as not psi. You saw that also in the poster previously of the conference. And on the left, you can see the table of contents, the different chapters that were represented today, for the most part. And mine is called 10 Concepts for Critical Psychology Praxis. So this is what I'll be talking about in a second. So the first one is the politics of citation. In Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed writes, a citational chain is created around theory. You become a theorist by citing other theorists that cite other theorists. In other words, citation is a political act, because as scholars, we have to consciously or unconsciously decide which theorists to cite. Citation is also an act of solidarity. Ahmed writes, citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow. For Ahmed, citations are the materials from which we create our dwellings. Furthermore, what Ahmed calls citational practice refers to not only who is cited in written texts, but who is speaking at events, which informed my decision of who to invite as keynote speakers at the 2019 International Critical Psychology Praxis Congress. Another source of inspiration, another citation, is the Cite Black Women Project, which is described as follows. In November 2017, Kristen A. Smith created Cite Black Women as a campaign to push people to engage in a radical praxis of citation that acknowledges and honors Black women's transnational intellectual production. I want to build upon these feminist initiatives and urge the reader to cite Southern theorists or theorists from the Global South. They may be literally outside of your comfort zone, hence the challenge. I recommend that you visit the following website, which is an open access encyclopedia of global Southern theory, globalsocialtheory.org. This is the site's description. This site is intended as a free resource for students, teachers, academics, and others interested in social theory and wishing to understand it in a global perspective. So you can see the influence of that, those different ideas in that site, and specifically on criticalpsychology.org. The Ethics of Liberation. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire shows that oppression is dehumanizing for both the oppressed and the oppressor. However, he argues that the oppressed must lead the way toward liberation because they know oppression firsthand. Oppressors can become comrades as opposed to allies in the collective struggle toward liberation, but Freire emphasizes they must authentically follow the leadership of the oppressed without exhibiting false generosity, which entails a profound rebirth on their part. Solidarity necessitates, among other things, a radical commitment to both anti-racism, as opposed to the two forms of racism, segregation and assimilation, and anti-capitalism, given the historical and ongoing oppressive reality of racial capitalism. In sum, an ethics of liberation, as Enrique Dussel asserts, is transmodern, or from the perspective of modernity's alterity, the oppressed, the colonized, or the damné, to use Frantz Fanon's term. So you can see how this informs the subtitle of the book, Psychosocial Non-Alignment to Modernity, Coloniality. Decolonial Aesthesis. In his 1935 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Walter Benjamin distinguished between the aestheticization of politics, which the Nazis mastered with their propaganda campaign against the subaltern, and the politicization of art. For example, think of the omnipresence of the swastika, originally a spiritual symbol in Hinduism, in Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. Incidentally, this propaganda film was released during the same year Benjamin's essay was published. For Benjamin, when art is mechanically reproduced, it loses its aura and becomes divorced from its origins in ritual and magic. This is how art, particularly under fascism, becomes politics in the modern era, hence why Benjamin rejected the notion of art for art's sake. Benjamin names a counter-ideological praxis along the lines of decolonial aesthesis. This praxis is the politicization of art. That is, producing decolonial aesthetic objects from the perspective of the subaltern in the spirit of consciousness raising or conscientization. Modernity, coloniality. Quijano argues that we cannot separate modernity, or postmodernity for that matter, from coloniality, because the colonization of the Americas essentially led to the establishment and acceleration of the modern world systems, i.e. racial capitalism, hegemony from then till now. And so the corrective is not fantasizing about a pre-modern, pre-colonial world, but actually drawing on material theories and practices from modernity's alterity in an effort to actualize a transmodern, decolonial world. This connects back to the first concept, the politics of citation. Delinking. Samir Amin popularized the term delinking, which names a praxis of alter globalization, or of moving from a Eurocentric to a polycentric world. In order for us to do that, we need to delink the rhetoric of modernity from the logic of coloniality. We can only do so by thinking and acting in the spirit of mondialization, that is an anti-racist, anti-capitalist international network of solidarity and cooperation. Praxis. Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach is the philosophers or psychologists have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. The statement is in essence what praxis is all about, and it was echoed more than a century later by Freire, who writes that praxis is reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. The principle of praxis explains the structural logic of the 2019 International Critical Psychology Praxis Congress, wherein the first day was dedicated to theory and the second to praxis. Both are equally important and interdependent. Criticality. Why was the signifier psychology barred in the title of the Congress? Many have asked me this question. There are a few reasons. Barring psychology emphasizes the two other signifiers sandwiching psychology, that is, critical and praxis. Also, I borrowed the theme of barred psychology from Ian Parker, who argues that Lacanian psychoanalysis is barred psychology because it is deliberately set against the rules of the game that psychologists follow in their version of scientific inquiry, and it presents theoretical accounts that seem designed to prohibit understanding on the part of psychologists. Transdisciplinarity. Criticality by default is transdisciplinary, for it is a metaposition. So whereas psychologists study psyche, critical psychologists study how psychologists study psyche, in addition to studying psyche qua subjectivity, which is more of a psychosocial notion, and so avoids the orthodox impulse of reducing psyche to mind, brain, or behavior. To put it differently, in their critiques of mainstream psychology, critical psychologists draw on theories and practices, or praxes, from other disciplines in an effort to envision a pluriversal or polycentric psychology. So barring psychology undisciplines and denaturalizes the field, hence renders it more complex. Intersectionality of struggles. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the signifier intersectionality, which is central to Black feminism today. This is a concept which Tommy Curry is critical of because it fails to account for Black male vulnerability, since it equates maleness with patriarchy without taking into account how the history of racial capitalism produced a man-not, that is, the Black male in the zone of non-being. Whereas Crenshaw conceived of the concept in terms of an intersectionality of identities, i.e., for example, being both Black and woman, Angela Davis, in her 2016 book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, revolutionized the notion beyond its foundation in identity politics with her emphasis on the intersectionality of struggles. In other words, for Davis, we must struggle together, not because we are of the same identity, but because we have common desires as comrades, which would render our liberation praxis enjoyable. Davis's radical reconceptualization allows for a praxis of international solidarity among scholars, activists, and practitioners inside and outside of critical psychology. Lastly, imaginative geography and historical knowledge. In Orientalism, Edward Said writes that imaginative geography and history help the mind to intensify its own sense of itself by dramatizing the distance and difference between what is close to it and what is far away. In other words, imaginative geography is a function of ideology, or what Louis Althusser labels ideological state apparatuses, like culture, education, and the media. I'm interested in mapping as an ideological practice, particularly since it is a form of imaginative geography that claims to be scientific. I want to demonstrate 3 map projections, and I want the listener to reflect on how each one affects your geographical imagination. And the premise of this is that science is political. So whether we're talking about psychology or geography, and because it is political, bias is central. And so Ignacio Martín Baró, who's a liberation psychologist, he made the point that bias does not make research less objective. So bias, in his case, that he was thinking about in terms of liberation theology, he was thinking about bias towards the poor or towards the oppressed, right? And so this idea of being value-free or apolitical is rejected. So mapping at the same time, while they claim to be scientific representations of the world, are actually political objects. And so if you look at the most famous and most used map ever, the Mercator projection, it was designed in 1569 by Gerardus Mercator. It exaggerates the size of imperialist powers like Europe and North America and shrinks South America and Africa. Now, this was done on purpose to trivialize the tricontinent or the global South, mainly Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So this map is rejected from a decolonial perspective. The second map was supposed to correct some of the distortions, but it has its own problems too. The Gall-Peters projection, designed in 1855 by James Gall and popularized in the 1970s by Arno Peters, the map shows the correct sizes of countries, but it also distorts them. Countries are stretched horizontally near the poles and vertically near the equator, so although the size may be right, the shape definitely isn't. So this map is also rejected. Now the third map, which is called the orthograph, it was designed in 1999 by Hajime Narukawa. The map substantially preserves sizes and shapes of all continents and oceans while it reduces distortions of their shapes. Now notice how this, of course, is the most accurate map that exists today, as far as I know, but you probably have never seen it before. And if you look at this map, look at how continents are positioned in relation to one another and how they're represented. So it just gives you a different imagination of the world, right? So this map I find inspiring to think about psychology, because what it does, it tries to solve this very particular problem of representing a 3D spherical complex reality two-dimensionally. And they do this, of course, and by following these steps. So a spherical surface is divided into 96 regions. The divided regions are mapped on 96 regions on an inflated tetrahedron while it maintains their area ratios. The divided regions on an inflated tetrahedron are flattened to be a tetrahedron while it maintains their area ratios. And then a rectangular world map is obtained by cutting out the tetrahedron. The obtained rectangular world map becomes the most accurate two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional spherical reality. So the question that I want to pose to end my presentation is, how can we as critical world psychologists, right? Not as critical psychologists who are only situated in the global north, but as critical psychologists from Brazil, from Chile, from Turkey, from Hong Kong, from Egypt, right? From indigenous communities, from Black communities, etc. How can we accurately map the complexity that is human subjectivity? And I was asked a question about mapping. Of course, mapping here is a metaphor in the case of psychology, but mapping basically refers to any form of representation. So when we're talking about subjectivity, when we're writing about subjectivity, we're mapping. We're reducing something that is a complex reality by using language, right? And representing that reality that way. So there are always going to be failure, but still we can try our best to accurately represent this complexity the way the orthograph tries to accurately represent the world. So I hope that ends the presentation, and I hope you all enjoyed our event together, and the video should be on the YouTube channel so you can revisit at any point.